Buenas tardes a todos. Vamos a seguir con las sesiones que llevamos dedicadas al significado social de las producciones cerámicas. Y en este caso pone Konstantinos de RAPTIS con su exposición sobre algunas observaciones sobre la reutilización de ladrillos y tejas de principios de época bizantina en estructuras medievales y postmedievales en Thessaloniki.
Byzantine brickstars are usually examined in the framework of production of ceramic building materials in workshops run or controlled by the Byzantine state through the army and the ecclesiastical hierarchy, mainly in Constantinople and in certain imperial cities of the Byzantine periphery, as Rome, Thessaloniki, and Nicopolis. Each one of these prominent urban centers had its own production of ceramic building materials of high quality, produced and used almost exclusively in public architecture of mainly the 5th and 6th century. Each city had its own system of different brickstones, and Boston is more known percentage of the production as trademarks to ascertain their circulation, to control the quantities of each order, and to certify the quality of the production. In this public structure, the brickstones were usually visible, since their purpose was fulfilled after their delivery at the construction site. Therefore, in their majority, the start side of the brick was placed facing down in order the embossed pattern, monogram, or wall to be attached to the mortar of the structure. In this framework, and before showing several brick reconstruction cases, the main types of the early Byzantine brickstones from Thessaloniki will be presented, including some unknown documented for the first time brickstones found in recent excavations. The bricks of the early Byzantine monuments of Thessaloniki have standard dimensions 30.8 to 41.5 centimeters, or 31.2 to 40 to 5.5 centimeters, but these are made based on the Roman and Latin Byzantine. It is characteristic, however, that in most cases the brickstones are implemented on bricks of the second category, made based on a foot of 31.2 cm wide. The surface of the remaining sides is further divided in most examples into two parts by a thin line, which is most probably shaped into the two wooden parts of which the mold was constructed. Based on the elements drawn from the bricks themselves, the most probably bricks were made of two smaller pieces, the joint which created a small gap, which was split by the main layer plate, creating an elaborate linear beam after it was fixed. The side walls of the mold were made of small pieces. The joints of these pieces with the main wooden surface of the mold on each border stamp are visible on the sharp edges of most bricks. The printed stamps had been made by engraving the negative of the mold with a sharp tool about 4.5 mm thick. In some examples, the negative of wall or part of the brickstone appears on the surface of the brick, and the reversal of its part in the mold was not perceived by its constructor. The main and most discussed in the bibliography brickstone type documented on bricks for the first time in the early Byzantine phases of the fortification walls, dated in the middle of the 5th century, as well in most of the ecclesiastical early Byzantine monuments in Thessaloniki, consists of variants of the monogram, which is analyzed in the Greek letters. Which is analyzed in the Greek letters EN or ENT, N or M, between two crosses, and in most of the cases with one or more letter of the Greek alphabet, namely the letters alpha, beta, epsilon, iota, kappa, and phi. All the variants of the monogram presented have been attributed by several scholars to the abbreviated word Endictionos or Endictionos, that means Endictio, and the combination of the monogram with Greek letters used also as numbers in the ancient Greek arithmetic system led to the performance of the respective brickstones as the means of controlling and identifying the brick production for public architectural programs and mainly the city walls in specific years of the Indictio, the first year of which was identified in the year 447-448. In the same moments, have been documented bricks bearing the letter theta that can be attributed to either a number or the name of the city, Thessaloniki. Bricks with a Latin cross in a circle that was previously interpreted as a symbol of the church, or bricks with a cross inscribed in a circle or a square. A third category of bricks with various independent symbols, usually crosses or individual letters, have been also listed. Rarer are the bricks consisting of a combination of the letters kappa lambda alpha or alpha lambda kappa, printed upside down the surface of the bricks. Unfortunately, no picture or drawing there to show. Additionally, bricks in later periods used for the first time in monuments of the 7th century, such as the 5 iron basilica of St. fragments of bricks with elaborate cross-shaped monograms have been found, related most probably to the production of bricks in the 7th century. Another type of brickstone, to be dated only once, has been attributed to a later production of the 7th or even the 9th century. A period where brickstones are really consists of a monogram which is read as Niki Theu, meaning Mother of God. Of particular interest is the unknown type of brickstone that was for the first time documented a few months ago, which bears the full name of XIIIth or XVIIIeXVIIIe in the general terms, XIIIth. Since all the bricks with the same seal, with the same stamp, made probably with the same wood, documented so far, the suffix of the name is worn or not visible. Given that the standard brickstone system of the early Byzantine brick production for Thessaloniki, another example with the main name has been documented so far, and given that similar bricks from Konstantinos bear the name of emperors or officers of the state, Eusebius mentioned on these bricks from Thessaloniki to be identified with the homonymous bishop of Thessaloniki during the latter decade of the 6th and the 3rd years of the 7th century. However, it seems that due to the quality and durability of the material, the early Byzantine bricks had the second life through their subsequent use in later structures. In Thessaloniki, after the elimination of the early Byzantine movement by the 7th century series of earthquakes, witnessed in the contemporary narration of the miracles of St. Dimitri, that according to both literary sources and archaeological data, resulted in the elimination of most of the prominent both secular and ecclesiastical structures of the city, including the urban infrastructure. The bricks were collected carefully from their own buildings to be used either in their restoration or in new public structures in the city. The fact that these bricks, and especially the stand ones, are usually met also in public works of the subsequent periods and have been barely discovered in less prominent structures of private character is probably due to the total collection of these ceramic materials, which most probably run by the public sector, and that they were possibly considered as property of the state or in the case of ecclesiastical foundations of the local deities. In most cases, the use of the early bricks with or without stands in later structures was dictated by practical and mainly economic reasons. On the one hand, the production was extremely costly. Additionally, the chronologically assembly largely organized in light industrial terms early Byzantine brickworks, which were arranged out of fortifications, were abandoned and eventually destroyed after the rural areas at the outskirts of the cities from the late 6th to the early 7th century became extremely insecure. Thus, the revival of the earlier workshops was practically impossible, while the relocation in densely populated urban areas, even though some smaller, mainly pottery production units have been found within the fortifications, usually in semi-urban areas close to city walls, was not easy. On the other hand, the good quality of the fine preparation of the clay as well as the fine procedure followed during the manufacturing of the early Byzantine bricks, and especially of those produced in official state workshops for the construction of public architectural projects, gave as a result their extreme structure and durability. It must be noted that in several cases, new bricks produced in modern either traditional workshops with strict technical requirements to be used for the restoration of the monuments in the past 2 or 3 decades have already started to deteriorate, while the original early Byzantine bricks of the same structures, it had not been cracked by seismic activity or destroyed by anthropogenic hazards, still retain their original strength. Based on the examination of 7th and 8th century masonry, it seems that the new bricks continue to be produced, though in lesser quantity, only for prominent structure and as a supplementary material to the used one. A particularly interesting case of Britain by recycling, which however falls short of the subject of the present communication, is that of the recycling of work or broken textiles, which they cannot really consume in them to produce ceramic packaging, used as components for structural models. In Thessaloniki, the case of brick recycling is presumed by the texture and the composition of the structural mortars in rehabilitation places of the monuments dating to the beginning of the 9th century. All the 9th century masonries in many buildings of the Thessaloniki are characterized by a homogeneous rich in ceramic aggregate mortar, which differs significantly from the structural mortars of the previous or 6th century. In terms of their components, texture and color, as the sum of these mortars it has been replaced with coarse-grained ceramic material. The significant increase in coarse-grained ceramic aggregates in the mortars of this particular period, after the devastating earthquakes of the third decade of the 9th century, that devastated mainly the superstructure of the monumental edifices in Thessaloniki, is probably due to the simultaneous availability of large quantities of broken bricks, resulting either from collapsed brickworks, as the brick-built walls and domes of the city's standing early Byzantine and pre-iconoclastic ecclesiastical foundations, which, instead of being discarded, were recycled and smashed into gravels to be used as raw material for the structural mortar of the same building restoration phase. However, returning to the subject of this communication, the stamped bricks bear the post-monographs, Christian symbols, and or names of Christian notation, after losing their original purpose as trademarks of the production, gained another symbolic use. The architectural documentation of medieval and post-medieval structures in Thessaloniki showcases that the early Byzantine stamped bricks, especially those with obvious Christian connotation, bearing crosses or crucible monographs, were posed in the most visible or symbolic places of the new structures, used always with the stamped face outwards on staircases or frescoes leading to ecclesiastical buildings, on the sills of arch windows, imperial structures, big steel bays in ecclesiastical buildings, and on floors of water concrete systems of the water supply system. The examples are many, but only a few will be presented in the limited time of the present communication. One prominent case is that of the bricks used in the 7th century restoration of the Byzantine Theophilus, in which the galleries as a large part of the superstructure of the monument have been recently artistic. It is clear that in the reports of the structural phase, dates of reproduction as well as used material have been used. The latter probably resulted from careful deconstruction of cut areas of the original basilica. In addition to the inherent bricks, sporadically the use of fragmented bricks has been also recommended. The stamped bricks that have been found in the 7th century masterpieces of the monument are less in percentage and are a second-hand material in the structure. Interestingly, however, bricks in the end monogram, accompanied by crosses, have been used in key positions, such as the fresco of the south gallery of the basilica. In the 9th century masonries of the same monument, the early Byzantine stamped bricks of the first phase are rare, and the few inner plans available apparently from the reconstructions of the masonry of the first phase after the earthquakes of the period 813-820 are used in places where they process of history, as in the outer seat of the three arched windows of the 9th century face of the sanctuary, most probably with an autopilot character, as the symbol of the cross is placed in the most vulnerable in the every openings of the sanctuary. A similar case is that of the early Byzantine stamped bricks, which were used with visibly very extras, with monitored crosses during the late 6th or 7th century repaired bricks instead of marble of a monumental staircase that led to an unknown ecclesiastical foundation in the northwestern part of the city. Even during the Ottoman or the so-called post-Byzantine period, early Byzantine bricks stamped with crosses technique used in religious structures of the Christian community of the city. As on the upper surface of the brick-built style of the church, it succeeded the little Byzantine main church of the monastery of Hagia Theodora in the center of the city. In the Middle Byzantine period, early Byzantine stamped bricks with their crosses on the upper Byzantine surface are used on the floor of the water conduits in the public water supply system of the city, in a way that they use is for the protection of the construction and the waters as well in the street. Before concluding, another new external service will be presented. Turkish, the late 6th and 7th century system of the public water supply system is the flow of the system that was automated in the late 19th, probably the 3rd century, is covered with one or more layers of obviously used as it is in many expanding bits, and then in a thick layer of hydronic mortar, which is applied to the natural rock that was later for the construction of the system. On the floor of the system, there is a large variety of more original parts dating from the 5th and mid-5th to the early 7th century, which in the ideological frame of the medieval society of the city
Hacían el consumo de esmalte de estaño portugués en los siglos XVI y XVII.
So this is not Tânia CASIMIRO, as you maybe can see. But she asked me to read her presentation, and she says, of course you have to imagine a little red-haired lady talking very fast with a Portuguese accent. She says, good afternoon to you. First and foremost, I would like to apologize for her absence. Me being Tânia was one who should be here with me. I was about to leave Lisbon on Tuesday evening when the phone rang. It was my daughter's school, saying that there were 2 COVID cases among her classmates. She was sent home, her daughter, and I had to stay there. I know that the same is happening to other people around Europe, so please stay safe. Secondly, we, the authors, want to thank Frauke WITTE, that's me, for her availability to read our paper. It is never an easy task to expose out loud other people's ideas. I got the paper yesterday, so it's quite new for me. So we will keep it simple. If you have any questions, Frauke will not be able to answer them. I wonder how she knows that. So she asked you to get in touch with her. Most of you have already listened or read several of our papers talking about Portuguese thin glazeware. When we started to study this ware 15 years ago, we were engaged in subjects such as production, distribution, and consumption. Today, we want to discuss other ideas and how Portuguese decorated wares reflect social, cultural, and ideological behavior. Although we could have used many different sites, we are going to talk about the discoveries made in Khalil. Khalil, is that right? Okay. Since it represents the life of common people. This site was excavated by Lisbon municipality archaeologists in 2013 and 2014 and corresponds to the abandonment of hundreds of medieval storage pits transformed into dumpsters. Inside these abandoned pits, thousands of objects of all categories were found, ceramics being, as expected, the most abundant. The collection was dated roughly between 1550 and 1650, which was an exciting moment in the history of Portugal and pottery production in this country. Not only were we dealing with a world of different ontologies and relations, we were also acclimated to the Spanish crown, which opened other markets. And Lisbon, the city where an elephant and a rhinoceros were engaged in a street fight in the 16th century, was clearly absorbing the influences of a globalized world. Yes. Okay. Plates, bowls, bottles, and other recipients correspond to what was used daily to eat food from at the table. These 100 years mark important moments in the production of this ware with enormous changes in terms of quality, quantity, and iconographic repertories, as we will demonstrate in a few moments. The first 10 glaze wares we found at this site are the typical caronited bowls, which were made in Lisbon at least since the late 15th century and which are going to continue to be made during the entire 16th century and in some parts of Portugal, still in the first decades of the 17th century. Most of these are plain white with a few simple decorations in blue. Most likely the main influence for such wares came from southern Spain, although that is still a debate we need to have. At this point, it is still difficult to define what was the cost of one of these vessels. However, we know that these were not cheap, especially because they do not appear in large quantities in the archaeological record when compared to red wares. Associated to carbonated bowls, there are always the plates with recessed bottoms. Some of you might wonder, how do we distinguish such wares from the southern Spanish productions? Well, sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. In the case of Cani, we were lucky enough to be able to do some archaeometric studies which revealed that most of these objects were Lisbon made, and the fabrics are somehow different between Seville and Lisbon. Of course, there are also Seville imports in the collection, although we did not include them in this presentation. Thin glazeware objects are going to be very similar until early 1570s, where documents and archaeological records start to reveal a different style of production. It is the moment when Lisbon potters start to paint the objects with blue, associated to a general increase in the quality of the wares, which makes them clearly distinct from what was being made up until then. We cannot define a specific influence for the development of such decorations. However, Italian Majolica and Southern Spanish productions seem to have played an important role. However, we have to be honest. Although European influences are there, the major influence was the relation with the East. Portland enters Europe in large quantities through Portugal in the 16th century, and its symbols are appropriated or assimilated, if you prefer, by European aesthetics. Portugal is most likely the first country where Eastern symbols are going to be used in such way in European ceramics. They start timidly with a little bird on top of a rock or a floral decoration. These symbols are rapidly used in every type of object. These objects are found in several households in Portugal, and a type of aesthetics which responds to European demands being exported to several places around the world. In the early 17th century, especially around 1620 and 30, the imitation of Chinese porcelain by European industries was already at its height, with similar things happening, with more or less success in France, Italy, England, and the Low Countries. These designs had an emotional and aesthetical value, representing the context with the East, supporting the imperialistic identity of some European countries, such as Portugal, Spain, England, and the Low Countries. It seems safe to say that Europe used and appropriated Eastern symbols and transformed them into concepts of European identity. These objects, more than fancy items, were used for decades to send political messages. Otherwise, why combine coats of arms of noble European families with Chinese paper rolls? They connect different cultures and different people, generating new meanings. We do not believe that those meanings and symbols were not recognized by Portuguese and on a larger scale by people who used such objects in different parts of the world. Even that sometimes the true meaning of a symbol, where it originated and its semiotic importance is not recognized anymore, the blue on white ceramics always had somehow exotic connotation, especially in a period from 1550 to 1650, when the presence and context with the East are consolidated across Europe. Everyday objects are fundamental vehicles of ideological changes. It is the widespread of such tablewares across the country, still in the first half of the 17th century, that brings a new aesthetical value into most households where people engage with a globalized world in their daily routines. Residing Canid is special since represents a moment when these changes are occurring, and we can see them in pottery and in the way consumer culture reacted to social and economic changes. This was the point where we were going to ask the audience to debate with us about the way that household ceramics are fundamental in understanding ideologies and identities in early modern Iberian Peninsula. But since we are not in the room, if anyone wants to start this discussion, to get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you. A continuación tiene la palabra Frauke WITTE con la exposición La expresión del simbolismo en la Europa de principios de época moderna en el sur de Escandinavia.
Well, now it's a Danish accent. Most of you people might wonder why it would be relevant to hear about Scandinavian ceramics in this auditory. And I think it is because some of the decorations, motifs, and ornamental techniques are imitations from the Mediterranean ceramics that we use in the Scandinavian ceramics. The post-medieval ceramic has over a wide area a common symbolic language when it comes to decorations. Tânia just talked about this European identity. There are lots of similarities, but also differences when you compare the North. And with the North, I mean the area of Scandinavia and northern Germany. When you compare it with the rest of Europe, the decorations are, of course, of Eastern origin when you start with it. But in the North, we used to say that they are imitations from Dutch faience, from Mallorca, and the Southern German earthenware, which again, of course, come from the Italian ones and Spanish faience and Mallorca, because of the trade connections. But not everything was taken over. We do not, for example, have illustrations of persons. They are very few. And we don't have the Christogram IHS. We have no form of art or other heraldic motifs or Chinese motifs in the Scandinavian area. And due to the lack of the raw material and burning technique, the post-medieval decorated ceramic in Scandinavia is not tin-glazed, but slip-painted earthenware. The vessels are generally, and also in the archaeological research, understood as four-part. And you all know that during many periods of human history, common people's art was dominated by decorated pottery. Lines and patterns on Stone Age vessels, for example, must be interpreted as a kind of decoration, and therefore as a kind of art to please the eye. And later, at the Viking Age and the Middle Ages in Northern Europe, this disappears completely, and the ceramic becomes a secondary thing only meant to be useful. But then, in the from undecorated black fire ceramics, the beginning of glazing in the 13th century, earthenware plastic pots slowly got a new look. Still, some of the products were black fired, which restricted the possibilities of decoration, of course. The changes in the ceramic tradition took place at the same time the Reformation could focus on the relationship between the individual and Christianity. And the Renaissance challenged the medieval perception of art. Changes in eating habits recommended new forms of weapons, bowls and plates, flat plates take over. The ornaments which characterized the locally produced artifacts through the most of the 16th and 17th century reflect the new development toward using decorated elements as symbols. And here the ceramic of tile stones can be used as an indicator for the changes. Stone tiles develop from only being functional to becoming a piece of art, from being undecorated, maybe glazed, and then decorated with motifs and different colors. The shift of tile form supports the decoration possibilities. At a point, it became possible to use the tiles for showing images of, for example, Renaissance lords or scenes from the Bible. Here, above the decorative element also carries a symbolic element and functions as a message. People knew the images over a wide geographical area and understood the owner's attitude. And the same observation can be made in the ceramics used for cooking and much more evidently for serving. Inside and outside decoration with motifs is not tied to the function. Besides geometric patterns, floral and figural motifs became popular at the end of the 16th century. The inspiration came from southern Europe with moving craftsmen and trade. However, due to a lack of technology, as I said before, we have earthenware in the north and not Provence. The first locally produced faience actually in Denmark and northern Germany is from 1755. So, the potter's workshops obviously should match the customer's need for not only earthenware but also for attitude-bearing symbols for their homes, and that was what Tânia just were talking about. The interaction between the producer, the potter, and the customer, the client, after 1500, for a while, came under the influence of the big religious and political questions of that time. Religious, floral, and geometrical motifs to a high degree came to mark the decorations of Northern European earthenware in this period. And as these motifs were quite the same all over Northern Europe, they can be interpreted as well-known symbols. Some of them in connection with the Bible, like the pigeon, the fishes, the pomegranate, you can see here at the goals. Written statements appear in Scandinavia in the 18th century. The intention of using writing on vessels is in the north explains that certain potters wish to separate themselves from other potters in a time where the written word got a higher intellectual status than the painting. In an archaeological context, it becomes evident as excavations of potter workshops from this period shows indications of specialization among the potters in different subjects. For example, this lived painted earthenware with inscription. In the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, Northern European society's ways of usually expressing their personal beliefs and statements were quite limited. Only a few people were able to present their stages and to decorate through the choice of clothes, and painting. Whereas all levels of society use ornamented pottery, whose different motifs and forms developed into a kind of everyday. And these could be displayed, for example, by hanging on the wall. From the written sources like inventories of castles and estates we have in the 16th century, we know that paintings and tapestries were used for decoration. Other things like books, silver candlelight holders, Italian glass vases, and so on were both useful and decorative at the same time. Not to mention, of course, the imported ceramics like faience and porcelain, but we have very little of them. For these people, especially in the castles and the estates, it was all important at that time in the development of a modern cosmopolitical lifestyle to express themselves. But what was with the inhabitants of the cities who could not afford all this nice stuff, or who did not have access to the exotic and expensive things? And what about the rural settlements? In the archaeological excavations on the rural sites and also in the cities, they show that there is imported ceramics like stone phalanx and later porcelain in the cultural areas, much less in the rural settlements. But in every social layer, you can find this kind of locally produced ordinary slip painted decoration from the second half of the 16th century onwards. And we also have finds of repairs and signs of holes in the ceramics showing that these goods have a certain value. And the one on your right hand side above, I actually stole it from Tanya's Facebook site. He doesn't know it yet. So, we know the paintings from the same time, mostly the Dutch paintings, showing households with materials of plates, which were placed on shelves at the wall. And it's of course not every time possible to decide whether it is porcelain or earthenware or metal or wood. We can see that they are arranged in a singular way and not on top of each other. And of course, sometimes it could be a storage situation shown, but in other situations, these plates are definitely shown with a decoration towards the viewer and arranged as a kind of art, sometimes together with other art pieces like paintings. So ceramic as a media for eating culture and intake of food had a central position in the social area. And we have to ask us if the owner and the potter at that time were aware of the motives and their messages, or if they just followed the fashion. Flowers and animals were in the post-medieval period common symbols of protection and defense. For example, the pomegranate is for fertility, and the bird for rebirth, and so on and so on. And the fishes for Christianity, Trinity, and especially the tulip for perfect and deep rebirth and forgiveness. In the Netherlands, the tulip, on your right-hand side above, became a big meaning during the tulip hype and the beginning of the 17th century. You may have heard about it when the tulip was worth more than a house. Also writings can be citations from the Bible, but also toasts often with a hidden meaning in the moral or education, like if you get too drunk, you get silly. So there's actually a strong persistence of the patterns over the whole area, and not very much local innovations telling us these things again and again. But what makes me very curious is an obvious time delay with which the motives is the law. If you compare these vessels, there are 200 or 300 years or more in between. But with the same motives. The tulip, for example, appears in my area first after 1650, what means after the crash of the tulip hype in the Netherlands, where the tulips are more blessed again in the 1620s and 30s, but first in the 1650s, the tulip as a motive reaches the north, and that is really, strange. So can we assume that these symbols still have the same meaning? Is the meaning of decoration in the 14th and 15th century in Spain or Italy the same as in the 18th century in Denmark? Or is it just a question of fashion? Did people know what they are showing when they buy it? Did the potters know what they were painting? Or was it just a nice thing? The same goes for the writings on the vessels. There's a gap somewhere north of the middle of Europe and through the Netherlands. And where this gap exactly runs, I cannot tell you. That would be an object for further investigations. But you can see here that there are early inscriptions on the writings. And the Scandinavians ones first came in the late 18th century. And again, did the potters know what they were doing? did they know how to write? If you see at the piece on the right side above, is it a kind of wannabe writing maybe? And we heard a presentation from Pamela Armstrong. I don't know if she's in the audience right now. On Tuesday, she was talking about this. What was she saying? Proof-esque thing. I don't know if you remember it, where you transfer motives, but without taking the meaning with you. This could be a thing. So the adaptation of inscriptions on vases took more than 100 years from southern Germany to northern Germany. And sgraffito, for example, appears in the north after the end of the 16th century. And it's not rocket science to take a wooden piece and scratch on a raster. So it must have something to do with what people wanted to express. This time delay phenomenon is not so easy to explain by lack of techniques or trade connections. Of course, we had the Hanse in the north as the big trade connections, but there were daily on sea connections with the Netherlands at the north and west coast. There were daily sea travel. And from the written sources, we know migration of potters from southern Germany to Scandinavia. So therefore, it cannot be found as a reason. And we also actually see, inscriptions were also, of course, going from the imported ware, like stoneware, where there's writing on it. But this time delay is also seen in the decline of the decoration, a reduction to names and dates, and few floral motifs, which happens around 1800 anymore, but much earlier in the southern areas, for example in Great Britain, France, and the Netherlands. I hope you can tell me from the audience if you recognize that. What is the situation with fires and Majonica? When does the decline of decoration happen? Is it much earlier than so, finally, the spreading of motifs and text on vases may be following the reading ability of the population. We have the Reformation, and we know that Luther's recommendation was that the population should be able to read the Holy Scriptures. By the end of the 17th century, most children in the Reformed areas were taught reading and religion. It is sad. The children's first reading book was Luther's Small Catechism. The practice of religion in everyday life included daily table and thanksgiving prayers, which is reflected in the Russian pottery by the inscription with quotations from psalms and prayers. So the question is, could they read, could they write, or could they just know these sayings by heart, these quotations by heart, and read what was written on the verse without being able to read it? But another possible way to explain the delayed implementation of the symbols and writing on locally produced symbols is offered by placing the distribution of writing versus non-writing geographically in the context of Protestantism and Catholicism. Regarding that, I only have seen a selection of the parameters, and we have to be very careful with these maps. It seems significant that the Catholic areas in the period about 1600 coincide with the areas where religious and secular sayings are common on pottery from the 15th century onwards, where in the Protestant area, on the other hand, such as the inscriptions only appear around and after 1700. I'm looking very much forward to these passages with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
A continuación tenemos la última exposición a cargo de Tony VOLPE, con el título Estudio social del uso del mobiliario cerámico en la Provenza oriental. El caso de Antides y de Can en los siglos XVII y XVIII a través de las fuentes escritas.
Donc, cette étude porte sur une analyse sociale du mobilier céramique dans la Provence orientale des XVIIe et XVIIIe siècles, à travers deux villes proches l'une de l'autre, Antibes et Cannes. Antibes est avant tout un port, siège d'une amirauté, une place forte de frontières importante, dont Vauban a parachevé les fortifications, comme on peut le voir sur ce plan relief de 1754. En effet, depuis Henri IV, le pouvoir royal a toujours voulu faire d'Antibes un verrou de la Provence face aux diverses invasions venues par le côté de Nice. Cannes, par contre, est un petit port de pêche, une petite ville plus modeste, mais qui comprend un domaine rural étendu, avec notamment le Canet, qui ne deviendra indépendant que dans la fin du XVIIIe siècle. Ces deux ports combinent néanmoins aussi bien la pêche que le commerce, et en particulier le transport par navire de productions bien connues des œufs et des valoristes et proches. Cette étude s'appuie sur les dépouillements de diverses sources écrites, justice et notaires principalement, dont sont issus des inventaires qui servent de base à cette approche. J'ai analysé les données qui entraient aussi bien à la batterie de cuisine qu'à tous les types de vaisselle susceptibles d'être en céramique, comme la vaisselle de table, de resserre ou d'ornement. Au XVIIe siècle, les dépouillements ont abouti à un corpus de 84 inventaires pour Antibes et 87 pour Cannes. Leur analyse montre qu'au XVIIe siècle, les vaisseliers antiquois et cannois sont très similaires. Le métal y prédomine, notamment l'étain qui est presque partout, et le bronze ou le vin, présent dans les deux tiers des inventaires, particulièrement avec des péroles ou chaudrons en grand nombre, des escoffères ou coquenards, des bassins et des tours de cruches. On a par ailleurs très souvent des mentions de houille de fer, marmite de fer, pignac de fer ou pot de fer, tous ces termes étant des synonymes de marmite. La terre n'est pas absente des deux corpus, mais dans une proportion plus faible que le métal. 9% pour Antibes et tout de même 21%. En effet, souvent les notaires ou les greffiers négligent la vaisselle en terre, car elle est de peu de valeur et mérite bien l'attention. La vaisselle du terre courante comprend des assiettes, des écueils, des plats, des couches, des tourques, des pichets sont aussi mentionnés à Cannes, de même que des oublières dédiées au service de l'huile. Les bassins, bassines, conques, un terme souvent employé dans les inventaires, sont aussi assez ordinaires. Parfois associés, la dourgue à tenir haut de la bassine de terre indique clairement un usage pour l'hygiène. Les houles, les marmites en terre, semblent très rares. Les houles en chair et les péroles ou chaudrons en bouse, qui sont très fréquents dans les inventaires, indiquent probablement un usage plus restreint de leurs équivalents en terre. Lorsque les pots de terre sont mentionnés, c'est plutôt pour un usage de recette. Ainsi, 13 pots de terre à tenir en choix gros ou petits chez un marchand en 1671, ou bien encore 100 pots de terre vernissés à mettre en choix chez un autre marchand en 1697 à Cannes. Il existe également des barriques de terre à saler les poissons. Ces usages sont bien sûr liés à la pêche pratiquée à Cannes comme à Antibes. Certains objets plus rares apparaissent à Antibes, comme des salières en terre, des bouteilles de terre à tourner vinaigre, même un fleurier de terre en 1642. Enfin, il faut signaler chez un marinier de Cannes en 1640 une vaisselle de table en terre de Pise. Il s'agit là sans doute d'une vaisselle en terre vernissée qui provient de Pise en Italie. Au XVIIe siècle, les actes n'avaient pas souvent la profession du statut social, ce qui rend difficile une étude sociale précise. Cependant, ces rares indications dans les sources écrites ont tendance à devenir plus fréquentes lorsque l'on célèbre l'échelle sociale et également plus nombreuses quand on se rapproche de la fin du XVIIe siècle. Malgré tout, à Cannes, les inventaires du XVIIe siècle témoignent de la présence de vaisselle et d'objets en terre dans presque toutes les catégories de la société, ce qui démontre sa diffusion très large en dépit de sa sous-évaluation patente dans cette source écrite. Il n'en va pas de même pour la faïence. La faïence, ou bougie, enfin la faïence souvent qualifiée de bougie, apparaît dans 7 inventaires à Antibes et 8 inventaires à Cannes, soit près de 14% des inventaires, avec de la vaisselle dans l'une et l'autre de ces deux. Sauf exception, ce sont le plus souvent là les catégories les plus favorisées de la société que l'on peut trouver éventuellement dans la faïence. Les plats sont les plus fréquemment rencontrés, avec parfois quelques assiettes. On trouve aussi des tasses ou des coupes. En Antibes, on note plusieurs fois la présence de bassins, à Cannes, de salières, et pichets apparaissent également. Ainsi, à Antibes, on a en 1623 une mention de 3 douzaines de pichets de Gênes, donc de la faïence de Gênes. À Cannes, en 1639, 4 tasses bougies de Gênes chez un patron de bateau qui les a peut-être apportées dans de ses voyages en Italie. Et à Antibes, au lieu de quelques objets isolés en bougie, on a des mentions de services de table en faïence dans les dernières décennies du XVIIe siècle, mais uniquement dans les catégories les plus élevées de la société, bourgeois, marchands, officiers. La porcelaine, à Antibes en 1648, un acte de vente par un apothicaire de ses ustensiles mentionne la porcelaine. 28 pots de porcelaine grands et petits, vernissés de blanc et bleu. Mais il s'agit en fait manifestement de porcelaine contrefaite, c'est-à-dire de la faïence en bleu et blanc. Les 33 pots de Gênes pour les sirops et huiles qui suivent dans le même acte sont d'ailleurs de la faïence de Gênes. Toutes ces diverses mentions relatives à Gênes témoignent d'importation de la Ligurie. Les jarres sont très répandus. Plus de 2 tiers des inventaires du XVIIe siècle mentionnent des jarres ou des jarrons, 69% à Antibes, 70% à Cannes. Les jarres qui servent à la liste certifiée de glaze, ce sont des demi-jarres dont la lèvre et la panse sont souvent renforcées de cordons digités. Le XVIIIe siècle, les deux corpus comprennent 112 inventaires pour Antibes et 204 pour Cannes. Les indications concernant le métier ou le statut social deviennent plus courantes dans les sources écrites, mais l'ensemble des inventaires d'Antibes et la presque totalité des inventaires de Cannes. Les gens de métier sont les plus souvent qualifiés de travailleurs, il y a parmi eux les gens les plus pauvres, à contrario, les ménagers sont des paysans aisés, à la tête d'une exploitation, et ils sont le plus souvent propriétaires. Les maîtres de métier donc les artisans qui ont une boutique et les patrons des bateaux. Les bourgeois sont essentiellement les rentiers de la terre. Les officiers comprennent tous les détenteurs d'un office ou de charge, comme par exemple les juges, avocats, notaires, lieutenants de la communauté. À Cannes, la plus grande proportion de ménagers à Antibes elles sont cultivées au point important sur le domaine rural avec le Canet et ses multiples amants. En outre, Antibes a une population urbaine relativement plus importante que Cannes, donc à Cannes la société rurale pèse davantage. Prédominance de la vaisselle d'étain, importance de la vaisselle en bronze ou en fer, d'où leur pourcentage encore important dans ces statistiques qui portent sur l'ensemble du XVIIIe siècle, mais moins élevé cependant que le XVIIe. De la vaisselle de terre, des marmites de terre, et puis déjà une certaine baisse de l'étain, alors que pour Cannes, y compris de 90%, c'est quasiment identique de 94%. Donc cette chute spectaculaire de l'Airain qu'on voit bien dans la deuxième moitié du XVIIIe siècle, parce qu'on tombe pour Antibes à 4% et pour Cannes à 9%, est déjà bien avancée en Antibes. Dans les années 1730-1740, où par ailleurs, comme vous le voyez, la faïence atteint déjà 44% dans les inventaires. Alors que les casinaires représentent dans 72 inventaires à Antibes, 126 à Cannes, donc beaucoup plus de mentions de terre que le XVIIe siècle. Parmi ces inventaires, on en a 66 à Antibes qui mentionnent de la terre commune et 106 à Cannes. Elle est composée de vaisselle de table et de services, des assiettes, plats rituels, gamelles, ce sont des éléments très courants qui vont souvent ensemble. Les étuels sont encore plus exceptionnels. Les cruches sont aussi très répandues avec parfois quelques indications de terre à lycée, comme d'ailleurs pour les tichets ou les pots de terre pour les femmes. Les pots de terre sont aussi très nombreux, souvent sans autre précision. 32 inventaires en Antibes, 47 à Cannes, mais on a également des pots de terre en terre à soupe, et même un pot de terre pour la boue en Antibes. Ces pots sont aussi employés pour la vaisselle de resserre, par exemple des pots à mouchoir. Il y a aussi le gaz, et on a même une broche de terre vernissée à Cannes. Les toupins, les toupines, on dit aussi topins, peuvent avoir une queue ou une ou deux oreilles. Ce sont aussi des vases grands ou petits qui vont au feu, destinés à utiliser une petite cuillère. Autre ustensile culinaire, les marmites, qu'on a donc beaucoup plus de mentions au XVIIIe siècle, puisqu'elles remplacent les houles de fer, des péroles de bronze du XVIIe siècle, et enfin nous avons des cafetiers qui correspondent à des nouvelles consommations de produits exotiques. La vaisselle d'hygiène, on a des bassins, bassines, cuvettes, des conques, un terme qui est très employé pour bassines. Des terrines, parfois vernissées, appelées aussi parfois tian ou tian, et on rencontre encore d'autres choses moins courantes, comme une chapelle, des pots de chambre, 4 inventaires. Et enfin, dans ces inventaires, on a un certain nombre de mentions avec des origines reconnues. Donc, surtout pour la terre de Biot et la terre de Damas, et même quelques bassins. La terre de Rome, il apparaît que les pelles des mailles blancs peu adhérents, le plus souvent, ce sont essentiellement des assiettes et des plats. Enfin, la faïence proprement dite. La faïence sans spécification d'origine est présente dans 47 inventaires à Antibes et 73 inventaires à Cannes, soit dans environ 49% et 42% des cas. Donc il y a un peu plus de faïence à Antibes. Elle est extrêmement variée et couvre toutes les catégories de vaisselle, de table, de services et d'hygiène, assiettes, plats et cuels, soupières, saladiers, terrines, cocotiers, fruitiers, jarres, salières, barils, cruches, etc. Certains objets sont associés aux nouvelles consommations des produits cosmétiques, notamment les cafés de sucre, les cafetières qu'on a déjà vues, de gel, des tasses, des théières, des soupiers. Les objets dédiés à l'hygiène corporelle comprennent 2 inventaires à Antibes, 1 à Cannes, même si quelques objets apparaissent à la toute fin du XVIIIe siècle. Le seul exemple d'un service en porcelaine se trouve chez un noble d'Antibes en 1760, les siècles de Retouche. Donc les jarres, au XVIIIe siècle, il y en a toujours beaucoup, en fait, elles sont encore plus répandues au XVIIe, puisqu'on en a 78% à Antibes et 74% à Cannes. L'augmentation du nombre de ces rencontres va de pair avec l'existence de jarres qui sont rencontrées. Mais contrairement à Grasse, à Antibes et à Cannes, ces jarres en prix apparaissent en nombre réduit. 3 par Antibes, 11 à Cannes. À l'issue de cette exploration dans les archives du XVIIe et XVIIIe siècle de ces deux villes portuaires de l'Est de la Provence, que peut-on retenir de la place de la céramique dans la vie quotidienne et dans les intérieurs antibouais et canadiens. Dans le XVIIe siècle, assez semblable à Antibes et à Cannes, il prédomine le métal, l'étain, le bronze et le sel. La terre cuite, d'usage quotidien, est essentiellement utilisée dans la vaisselle de table et de service, ainsi que pour la recette. Le développement de la culture de l'huile d'olive amène à une nécessité d'un stockage et donc l'acquisition par tout un chacun de nombreuses jarres, en particulier pour les petits de piottes. La faïence reste rare et contenue aux catégories supérieures de la société. Et donc on ne s'étonnera pas des changements, l'arrivée de la faïence.
A la última pregunta, vamos. Luego tenemos un café más larguito. Ahí podemos hablar de todo. Pues preguntas para Tony Ball, para su exposición sobre el estudio social del uso del mobiliario cerámico en la provincia oriental, en el caso de Antibes y de Cannes en el siglo XVIII a través de las fuentes escritas. ¿Alguna pregunta? Bueno, pues, si no hay preguntas, pues pasamos al café, que luego tenemos un café más larguito. Y el café tenemos hasta las 6 menos 20, que empieza la siguiente sesión. Muchas gracias.
No. Igual es todo. R. Sì, me la senti?
17:40, sì.